And that, Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's continue with chapter 39. Joseph is now in Egypt. That's how the chapter begins. Joseph was brought down to Egypt. In verse number 1, the Ishmaelites brought him down. And we discussed that exactly how Joseph got down there. But in any event, chapter 39, verse number 1, the Ishmaelites brought Joseph to Egypt. And we have already commented in the past on some of the parallels between the story of Ishmael, his banishment, his expulsion from the house, and the story of Joseph. Those two stories are similar in certain ways, and we will get back to that later on as we proceed through the rest of the book of Bereshit. Joseph comes to Egypt, and as we saw last week, first few verses of chapter 39, he starts as a slave in the land, a foreigner slave in the land of Egypt. He can't start any lower than that. But he very quickly is moving up in the world. And that is detailed in chapter 39 in the following way. First of all, in the second verse, it simply says that God is with Joseph. And Joseph is successful, matzliach. The Chumash doesn't tell us in what sense or what he actually is doing, but he's successful. God is with him. In the house of his master, the Egyptian. We commented last week, just to review, that there's a focus on the idea that Potiphar is an Egyptian in the very first verse, each Mitzri. So we'll keep that in mind. But then we're told since Joseph is very successful, and in verse number 3, Pasuk Gimel, Vayara Adonov ki Hashem ito, and it's clear to his master. Potiphar is called his master. Adonov is Adon. We'll get to that later. His master sees that God is with him, incredibly. And it's interesting that the name of God that's used over here is Yud He Vav He, the very personal name of God for Israel. Striking. Potiphar understands that there's something special about this fellow, that God is with him. And Vayisharet Oto. That's a step up in the world. He becomes his valet, his personal servant. He's not just one of the slaves. Potiphar, I presume, has many slaves. The man has a jail in his basement. But Joseph is special. Joseph is his misharet. And the Chumash continues in the next 3 words, Vayafkideo al beito. He appoints him over his house. That's a big job, not just a personal valet, but he appoints him to be in charge of the house, some kind of administrative position. And then the continuation is B'chol yeshlo natan biyado. And all that he had, everything that he had, he placed in his hands. So this is an enormous responsibility. He's over the house. And bayit can mean the physical house. Bayit can mean the people in the house. Maybe he has 100 servants. And Joseph's in charge of that. And not only that, everything that he has, he places in his hands. And now the Chumash continues in the 5th pasuk. And from the time this happens, and from that time on, Vayivarech Hashem et Beita Hamitzri B'Glai Yosef. So God, Hashem, blesses the house of the Egyptian on account of Joseph. Vahi Birkat Hashem B'Chol Asher Yeshlo V'Bayit U'Vasadeh. And the Chumash adds that the blessing extends not just all that he possesses, but all that he possesses in the house, and then the Chumash adds in the field, in the Sadeh. So Joseph is in charge, not just of the house, not just the administration of the house and his possessions, but specifically the house and the field. So Potiphar has fields as well as a house. He also, we see, has a jail. And now the next verse is very striking. Verse number 6, Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef. That's the next verse. Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef. And that's a very interesting word. Vayazov. Vayazov is to leave behind, or to leave, or to forsake. So the construction of this verse is very strange. Vayazov, he forsook all that he had into Joseph's hand. Here they translate he left, but Vayazov was stronger than left. It's left, but it's Razov means to depart from something. I will not leave you. Lo ezavcha, God said to Jacob. Lo yodai told Ma'uma, and he doesn't pays no attention to what he does. He completely hands it over to Joseph. Joseph's in control of everything. By Yazov, you get a sense that Potiphar is simply absent. He absents himself. He knows nothing that he does. He concerns himself with nothing that Joseph does, except very strange phrase, except for the food that he ate. So that's Joseph now has one might say in effect, Joseph replaced Potiphar. In terms of administration, Joseph is doing, and Potiphar doesn't know even what he's doing. So there's an element here of trust, because every time Joseph does something, there's blessing. He brings blessing to everything he touches. So now he's giving Joseph everything: the house, the field, and he doesn't know what he does. He doesn't check up on him. He simply trusts him, except when it comes to the lechem. We'll get back to that. And now we have the strange last few words of verse number 6. Vayhi Yosef Yifei Toar Bifei Mareh. Now Joseph, here they translate well built and handsome. That's the English Sephariah translation. I don't know. I think it's a JPS translation. Well built and handsome. I wouldn't have used those words, because well built and handsome sounds like, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that. He's the, Charles Atlas. But that's not Yifei Toar Yifei Mareh. Yifei Toar Yifei Mareh is a expression that the Chumash uses earlier for example, Rachel, his mother. It's an expression, Yifei Toar Yifei Mareh, that typically we find solely in the Torah and probably in the Tanakh in general, as a description of beautiful women. We don't find that description for men. The closest we come to it elsewhere is the description of David in the book of Shmuel. Yifei Einayim, the Tov Roi, similar, but maybe comment on that later. But what is that expression doing here? For if the Chumash was simply interested in telling us that Joseph was good looking, why does it say it only after this, for the Torah, long description of Joseph's ascent within the house of Potiphar? And what I would suggest over here, as we begin our study this morning, is that there are servants in homes, slaves or servants in homes. What's the name? Ellinson's book, Invisible Man. And these people are invisible. Not really people. They're people, of course, but they're people that the master uses for the master's own purposes. They're not really taken serious as people. And then when Joseph came down to Egypt, the Chumash suggests to us, is he really a person? He's a Hebrew slave. He's one of the help, probably on the lowest rung of the ladder. But gradually he was moving up in the world. So he's first the house, and then the field, and then everything, and then the Potiphar pays no attention to him. He's totally in control. And suddenly he's a person, and suddenly he's a beautiful person, having moved up the ladder in a place of real power. Then suddenly the text and Mrs. Potiphar will take notice of him. Suddenly he's beautiful. Suddenly he's attractive. And that's the next verse. And that's our introduction to what happens next with Mrs. Potiphar. But before we get to Mrs. Potiphar, which is the crux, the main story in chapter 39, I want to make another comment about verse number 5. That strange verse, Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef. That strange construction. Vayazov, to leave, to abandon, to forsake. And I think here, what's interesting to note is that what the Chumash has done is to set up for us another story. There's another story that, and it's hard to know, when you're reading this, it's hard to know whether this is the primary story and the other story later on plays off it, or whether already over here, the Chumash is anticipating. The Chumash uses the language here, for it anticipates a later story. And the latest story I'm referring to, of course, which plays off the phrase Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef v'lo yadai to me'uma ki amar lechem asher hu ochel. And this actually is a very important point. There's a story later which exactly plays off these words. And the story, of course, is the story of Moshe. And Moshe, when Moshe leaves, one might say, runs away from the land of Egypt because Pharaoh wants to kill him, because Moshe has killed an Egyptian taskmaster. And Moshe runs off and leaves from Egypt, and he ends up in the land of Midian. And when he comes to the land of Midian, first thing he encounters is he comes to a well, and there are women who happen to be the daughters of the priest of Reuel, who were waiting to get water from the well. And it's their turn to get water from the well, but the other shepherds, but the men, presumably, chase them away. They don't let them take their water. And when Moshe sees this, he intervenes on their behalf. Vayokom Moshe Vayoshion, the end of the second chapter of the book of Shemot, Vayashket Sonam. So he helps them, he protects them. Chumash uses the word, he delivers them. Vayoshion, he's a Moshiach, he saves them. And they go home. He doesn't speak to them, and they don't speak to him, they don't thank him. They go their way, he goes his way. And they come home to Yitro. And Yitro says to them at the end of the second chapter of Shemot, this is chapter 2, verse number, let's find that very quickly for you. Chapter 2, verse number, here it is, verse number 16. After Moshe has helped them at the well, they went back to their father Reuel, chapter 2, verse number 18 it is, chapter 2, verse 18. And he says to the daughters, how come you're home so soon? See that last right there. Why did you come home so? Because apparently this happened all the time. They would go to get water, and the other shepherds would push them away. And the weaker women, whatever it is, and they would be the last on line. So today they come home 4 hours earlier. What happened? Ish mitzri hitzilanu miyad ha'olim. Some Egyptian man saved us. Hitzilanu, saved us. Powerful word from the shepherds. Not only that, v'gam dalo dalalanu v'yashger atzon. So now he saved us, and he also watered the flock for us. That's what they say to their father Reuel. So Reuel says, "Vayomer obeno tov v'yayo," and Reuel said to his daughters, "Really? So where is he? Lama zeh azavten et ha'ish kiren lo v'yochalech." Why did you abandon the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Now, of course, the second you read this, obviously, you connect it to the pasuk of Yosef. Vayazov kol asher lo biyad Yosef v'yodai to mu'uba ki emallechem asher hu ochel. Obviously, the two verses speak to one another. And now the question is, that's obvious. Now the question is, what do we make of this? And I'll say one thing we make of it, and there's a lot more. First of all, the difference between Reuel, who is also called Yitro in the next chapter, and Potiphar. The difference is that Potiphar is very appreciative of what Joseph does, and he seems to constantly give him more and more control over the house, more power. But except for the lechem. And except for the lechem means that there's something, he can go this far, but he can't go farther. Now we have to remember something about the lechem, which the Chumash, as the Torah does, is setting something up for us. You say, he has everything except the lechem. And that could mean, well, he basically has everything. There's one detail he doesn't have. Or it could mean something else. He has everything but the lechem is all important. And in point of fact, when you read the Joseph story, that is from here to the end of the book, what is very clear is that lechem is not a small detail in the Joseph narrative. In fact, it's the central detail. Vayar Yaakov kiyem lechem right b'Eretz Canaan. Yesh lechem, there's lechem, which the Torah will use other words for as well, such as shever. But fundamentally, the lechem is absolutely essential to the Joseph story. And later, we're told when the brothers come down and eat with Joseph, they set 3 separate tables. For Joseph, for the Egyptians, and for the brothers. Because the Egyptians cannot eat lechem together with Joseph, who is their viceroy, who's the second in command in the land of Egypt, but he's still not an Egyptian, and they can't eat lechem. So what we have in the case of Yitro is the acceptance of Moshe by Yitro is accentuated when you see the parallel story of Joseph, and that is the inability of the Egyptians to fully accept. I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent, but Joseph is not fully accepted. And that's the idea of the lechem. And of course, what is striking is that Yitro, or Reuel, is the priest of Midian. The Midianites are the ones who bring Joseph down to Egypt. The Ishmaelites bring him there, but the Midianites took him out of the pit and sold him. So the Midianites, as chapter 37 ended, Miyad Habedanim, the Midianites are the ones responsible for having Joseph removed from Egypt. But the priest of Midian, Yitro, is the one who is helpful to Moshe, who helps Moshe, who gives Moshe refuge, and gives him his daughter, and later will give advice about how to run the country, about the system of justice. So that Midianite is the one who helps, one might say, helps Israel return to the land. First set of Midianites, they're middlemen in each case. But here we have a very nice example where the Torah says a verse, and the verse strikes us as strange. Vayazov kol shelo biyad Yosef, ki yim alechem. So we think about that, and then later on we come to Yitro, we say, all right, now I understand. That's the point. I think that's fairly obvious. Now let me make another point about the connection between the two stories, and that is that what it suggests to us, without going into it now, the connection between Yosef and Moshe, it suggests to us that maybe there are other links between Yosef and Moshe. And in point of fact, as we proceed through this, as we get to Shemot together, there are many, many links between Yosef and Moshe, which have to be explored very deeply. One might say that Moshe picks up where Yosef leaves off. Moshe is a continuation of what Joseph begins in terms of Joseph's last statement about God will redeem you and bring you back to the land. And then Joseph dies at age 110, which means it's not 120. It means it's premature in the sense, what might Joseph have done had Joseph lived? It's a very good question. And we'll get to that. But Moshe picks up where Joseph leaves off. So I gave one example, one obvious example where the two stories, where the language of the two stories relate to each other. And then, of course, when you see one, we always think maybe there are many, many, many more, which in fact there will be. Okay, so this is now we get to the story of Mrs. Potiphar. Let me stop here for a moment to take comments or questions, and then we will continue with Mrs. Potiphar. If anybody has a comment or a question at this point.
And if you're an attendee, feel free to request to speak, and I'll unmute you.
Can we make something of the fact that on Pesach we make such a point of matzah as opposed to lechem? To pick up on what you said with lechem and with, that whole thing.
Well, I would say apart. Right. I mean, matzah is also called lechem, it's called lechem only. So matzah is
right.
lechem, but it's of course lechem, which is not fully baked, which is not fully, So, I mean, there is a lot to be said about matzah as opposed to lechem, that's for sure. What I've said in the past, among other things, is that the Chumash will present the Exodus from Egypt not as a story in which the bond between God and Israel is full, because it's lechem in the Chumash represents covenant, represents affiliation. If you eat bread with someone, they eat lechem together, right? Whether it's the human being bringing the sacrifice or whether two humans. Yitro will eat lechem with Moshe later. In chapter 18, he breaks bread with Moshe.
Our Sinai, right?
Right, in our Sinai, in chapter 18, just before the Ten Commandments. And so if lechem is a covenant, then I would say matzah is a covenant being a full relationship. I would say Israel, upon leaving Egypt, has a half-baked relationship with God. As we see, it's not complete yet. And that's one of the significances of matzah is that a half-baked relationship. As we know, they're going to complain constantly. And the Chumash is suggesting to us that the goal is to move from the half-baked relationship to a full relationship as we move through the stories of the Chumash, the story of Shemot, etc. So I would say that's true. But the matzah is also called lechem in the Chumash. It's not. You also have, we had it earlier in the book of Bereshit. When the angels come to Lot's house, he gives them matzah. When they come to Avram's house, he gives them lechem. Sadu, right? He gives them a suda, lechem, right? So that's also important. It suggests the relationship, matzah versus the lechem, Lot versus Avram. Okay, anybody else for a comment or question? Oh, if not, I'll just move forward. Is there anybody in the chat?
Nope.
Okay, so let's continue then. So we're starting now with chapter 39 in the 7th pasuk. Vahi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, v'tisah eshet Adonav et hineh el Yosef v'tomer shechva imei. So after these things, meaning after Joseph has assumed the position of great authority in the house, and we could even suggest he's somehow, from her perspective, replaced her own husband. Because Vayazov Kol Shelo B'Yad Yosef, he sort of checked out. Potiphar sort of checked out. Joseph has replaced the husband. Joseph has the power. And when he has the power, suddenly he's a beautiful person. And she propositions him, Shechva Imei. Now, before we get to Joseph's response, which we'll spend some time on, I want to make the point come back to a point that we made earlier in the very first verse. Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Hurad Mitzrayim, the Ishmaelites brought him down there to the house of Potiphar, Ish Mitzri. So the Ish Mitzri is superfluous. Of course, we know he's a Mitzri. He's in Mitzrayim. And second of all, in chapter 37, it mentions the same, has exactly the same pasuk, minus the words Ish Mitzri. And the point here is that Ish Mitzri is not an informational point about Potiphar, but rather is saying something else. The story we're about to read is about the Mitzri. And the Mitzri, as the Mitzri appears in the book of Bereshit. And the first time we have the Mitzri as a narrative about the Egyptian in the book of Bereshit, that's the story of Avram going down to Mitzrayim. There's a famine, just as there's a famine. And Avram says to Sarah, his wife, let's go to Mitzrayim. I know it's a dangerous place. You're very beautiful. They're going to see you. They're going to want to take you because you're beautiful. Isha yifat mare'at. Exactly the description we have of Joseph in verse number 6. And if they think that I'm your husband, they'll kill me and they'll take you. So therefore say you're my sister. That's what we know about Mitzrayim. And in point of fact, it doesn't work out well because the one who Avram presumably thought he would, saying the brother, maybe he would negotiate for her, maybe he would stall them and they'd be able to leave Egypt together. That's how the Ran, Rabbi Nissim, understood it. That's I think a good interpretation, but he didn't take into account you can negotiate, you can stall when you deal with a normal Egyptian, but you can't negotiate when it comes to Paro. There's no negotiation with Paro, and Paro is told by the officers of his officers, is a beautiful woman, and he grabs Sarah. So it's a place where people take what they see, regardless of any moral calculations. There's no moral calculation. You like it, you see it, you take it. Seeing and taking, which is the primal sin of the book of Bereshit, which appeared earlier in chapter 6. The Bnei Elohim see and take the daughters of the human, ki tavotena. And now, in this story over here, we have a variation on that theme, except that in this case, it's striking that the one who's doing the seeing and the taking is not the man taking the woman, but in this particular case, it's the woman who wants to take the man, who is described, however, in feminine terms, in terms that the Chumash describe both Sarah on one hand, Isha Yifat Mare'at, and in terms that the Chumash describes Rachel, Joseph's mother. That's going to be the story. And the question will be about our hero, Joseph. Who is this guy? Is he still Jewish? I mean, he was kicked out of the family. His own brothers try to murder him. And now the question will be, of course, how the Chumash presents Joseph, how Joseph presents himself within the biblical text. Is he the Egyptian? Is he the Jew? He's moved up to a position of real power in the house of Potiphar. He's in charge of this apparently massive estate, a house, fields, and as we'll see, there's also a jail inside the house. So this is not any normal person. He's a sar. He's an officer, and he's a sar tabachim. He's the chief butcher of Egypt. Again, what he butchers, humans or animals or both, we don't know. But you're talking about a person who has immense power. And now the question is, what about Joseph? And now we have verse number 8. Vayima'en. He refused. L'ma'en is to refuse. Joseph said no. He refuses to get involved with Mrs. Potiphar. And now, that's what the Chumash tells us. And now the Chumash reports what Joseph says. So let's read what he says, then we'll comment on this on these psukim. Vayomro eshet Adonai. He said to the wife of his master, Hein Adoni lo yodai iti ma babayit v'chol asher yesh lo natan biyadi. So he repeats to the master what the Chumash has already told us, which is accurate. Look, he says, look here. My master, he refers to Potiphar, he says Adoni, his master. My master doesn't know what happens in this house. As the Chumash said earlier, lo yodai tol ma'uma. He knows nothing of what he does. Says Joseph, my master, Potiphar, your husband, my master doesn't know what goes on in the house. And not only that, everything he has, he put into my hand. All that he owns, he's placed in my hands. Let's just read first the speech, one more verse. There's no one who wields more authority, literally greater than me. There's no one greater than me in the house. He has withheld from me nothing. Except for you. Because you're his wife. How then could I do this great wicked thing? And I would sin against God. That's Joseph's response to Mrs. Potiphar. It's one of the highlights of Joseph's career, no question. And so he refuses, but he doesn't simply say no. He actually explains. And he gives an explanation why he cannot get involved with Mrs. Potiphar. And what is the explanation? So let's say what I think he's saying. Then the question is how she hears it. Well, she may hear it differently. It strikes me he's saying certainly two things, and I believe he's saying three things. Let's start with the two obvious things that Joseph says. The first thing he says is, the reason I can't get involved with you is because my master trusts me. It's a matter of trust. He trusts me to do the right thing. He doesn't check up on me. He doesn't even pay attention to what I do. He has implicit and explicit trust in me fully. And he places everything in my hands. So the first point is the trust. And the second point, which is clear in verse number 9, is a second point over here, which is that not only does he trust me, so that's one reason I cannot get involved with you, because I can't break a trust, and implicitly suggesting you shouldn't break the trust either, I would say, but he talks about himself. But there's something else, which is everything that I have, I owe to that person. That person has done so much for me. How could I then, behind his back, do something hurtful to him? It's not right. It's a idea of hakarat tov. Someone helps you. You have to recognize that someone helped you, and you shouldn't try to harm them in any way. So for those two reasons, he says, I have to say no. I have to refuse. That's reason one and reason two. And then he adds to this, if I would do this wicked thing, it would be a sin against God. So he says that's not just a kind of between me and my master Potiphar, but it will be a wicked thing if I break a trust and demonstrate complete lack of any kind of appreciation for what someone did for me. That would be sinful before God. So one can read that as simply the two main reasons: the breaking of the trust and the the, not paying attention to or not recognizing that someone has helped me and done so much for me. And it frames it though in kind of religious terms. This would be the wrong thing to do. This will be a sin before God. There's another way to read this as well, which is that he's saying two things and a third thing. And the third thing is the following, which is the following. He's given me everything except for you. You're the only thing I don't have, he says. How then could I do this wicked thing and sin before God means something different, which is the human being can't have everything. That's the first story of the Chumash, basically. The story of the Garden of Eden. You can eat the fruit of all the trees you can eat, but there's one tree you can't have. One fruit you can't have, the fruit of the tree of good and knowledge of good and evil that you can't have. Because if you would have that also, if you would have everything, then you might be God, or you might think you're God, which is actually the reason, if you think about it, why we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden in the first place. God says at the end of chapter 3 of Breshit, look, God said to God's entourage, the humans become like us to know good and evil, and now the human may stretch out his hand and partake of the tree of life, and live forever. So the human will be omniscient, all-knowing, and also immortal. That would make the human God. And God says, I don't want the human to be God. Human is a human being and not God. Human is limited. God is not limited. So what we can read this verse additionally to what he clearly says about trust and about appreciation. And that's a religious, those are religious values. It'll be saying something more. It says the human being can't have everything, which is actually a very important point. And I think specifically someone who actually has the ambition to rule, someone who craves power, such as Joseph. It's about somebody who has dreamed when he's 17 years old that the sun, the moon, and the stars bow down, and that the brothers grovel before him. Such a person, how do we judge people? By their dreams. So this is the dream. He's certainly a person who has ambition. There's no question about that. But, and I say Dafka, such a person, has to also understand you can't have it all. Otherwise you'd be God, but you're not God. You're just a person, a fallible human being. So that's another way to read the verse, which I like very much. That's the third thing he's saying. Maybe not even so much to her as more the text speaking to us. But in any event, it's not just that he said no. Fine. Now, let me get back to another point about this speech, which is critical speech. Before we get to his reported speech, back in verse number 7, we have the word Vayima'en, he refused. And that's actually very important. So he said no, he refuses. He's not going to get involved with her. Vayima'en. Now the word Vayima'en is an important word. And Rashi brought a medrash. Joseph refused, says Rashi, at that moment, he saw the image of his father Jacob before his eyes. That's what Rashi quotes. Famous Rashi, he saw his father Jacob. Whatever he intended to do, not intended to do, the Midrashim are replete with stories that he really was interested in her, he really was going to accede to her request, but at the last minute, he sees his father's image. Now the question is, where is that coming from? Where is Vayima'en coming from? This little drush, or the little drush.
Yaakov also said Vayima'en.
Excuse me?
By Yaakov, it also said Vayima'en.
Yes, it does. I said very well, yes, exactly does. And that's what they're picking up over here. And it's not just the drush. The Medrash connects the Vayima'en of the end of chapter 37 to the Vayima'en of the beginning of chapter 39. Remember, 38 is the story of Judah and Tamar. So it's a separate story. But if you think about the Joseph story, the word Vayima'en appeared not long ago. Towards the very end of chapter 37, it's when Jacob hears or is told by his children that they found this bloody coat of Joseph. Joseph is missing and presumed dead, and they all arise to console him. All his sons and daughters arise to console him, says the Chumash. Vayima'en lehitnachen. He doesn't accept the consolation. If he accepts the consolation, Joseph is dead. If he accepts nichum avelim. No, I don't accept it because I don't accept the fact that he's dead. So I can't accept your consolation for his death because I think he might still be alive. I didn't find the body, found the coat. So that's the story of the father not giving up on his son. And now the Medrash connects that to the Vayamain over here, which says that Joseph hasn't forgotten his father. In other words, the point of the Medrash is that the response of Joseph to Mrs. Potiphar is a function of Joseph's upbringing, of Joseph's connection to the teachings of Jacob, teachings of Israel, and distinguishes him from Mitzrayim. Says the Medrash, bottom line here, from a moral standpoint, religious moral standpoint, Joseph has not assimilated. He's a guy who's going to assimilate like crazy. But from this step, on a certain ethical plane, no, he can't do it. And the Medrash says maybe still the teachings of his father, with whom he was very close, still stick with Joseph. That's Vayimayin. That's point number one. Now there's another question I wanted to raise over here. It's a question about the verses, but of course, it's a question about life, which is this. Joseph explains, and my question is, it might have been better for Joseph not to explain, to say, sorry, ma'am, I'm not interested. Thank you, take it as a compliment, I'm not interested, whatever, and move on without the explanations, which are very good explanations. He explains what it's all about, breaking trust, about appreciation of what someone's done, etc. He's explaining it. But the fact of the matter is, when you give an explanation, it's just say no, what about no, don't you understand, right? But when you start to explain things, then it can be heard a different way. And it's possible that Mrs. Potiphar actually hears what Joseph says differently, and then what Joseph actually is saying. Because what does he say? Listen, he says to her, your husband doesn't know what the heck goes on around here. He has no one, he'll never find out anything I do. He doesn't even check up on me. And she's saying, that's right. That's exactly what I'm saying. We'll never know the difference. He doesn't check up on you. And he says, listen, he's given me everything. I'm the most powerful person around here. And she's nodding, exactly. That's why I'm interested. In other words, he says so-called explanation, which we appreciate, but I'm not sure she's hearing it the same way. And he says, he'll never know, and I'm very important. But it would be wrong. So she's hearing that as a contradiction. You just told me the reason for yes, then you say, but it would be wrong, which doesn't register altogether in her thinking. It would be wrong. That's irrelevant, So the only way she understands Joseph is what she claims later. This guy's teasing me. This guy's taunting me. This guy's playing with me. But he didn't really say no. He says yes, and then he says he can't. So that's the way that's one way to understand what she's hearing. So he might have been better off without explanations. This is the halacha, whatever. I can't do it. I'm sorry, very sorry. And then you can't be misunderstood. So that's a question in general in life. Often when we start to explain things. Okay, yes, I'll stop. Any comments or questions here?
Yes, Laszlo, I see you have your hand raised.
Laszlo, go ahead.
You need to unmute yourself.
Laszlo. Unmute. Okay.
Yes.
He might also have awakened her own self-consciousness by saying, we can't betray this man. She may have felt suddenly that same feeling. Oh my God, I am betraying this man.
Possible.
He trusted me.
It is certainly possible. Look, the Chumash, as many have noted, tends not to psychologize its characters. So it's very hard to know. The Chumash doesn't, unlike, say, some of the Greek stuff, it's very psychological. That's not to say the Chumash never psychologizes, or the Bible never psychologizes. Sometimes it does, but for the most part, it tells us what people say and what people do. And most of the time doesn't tell us what people are thinking. There are exceptions to that rule. For example, in the book of Shmuel, King Saul the writer will often tell us what Saul is thinking. It almost never tells us, with one exception, what David is thinking. So so in general, it doesn't say. So Abraham at the Akedah, what is he thinking? I mean, we try to glean it from the words, but the fact of the matter is that it's very hard to know what he has awoken in Mrs. Potiphar. But my point, I would say, I would have to lean towards this thought that not to give a generous reading to Mrs. Potiphar, just because, as I mentioned earlier, it's always about Mitzrayim, the Mitzri, and what we know of Mitzri in the Chumash is that seeing and taking, which is the primal sin of the Bible, seeing and taking, because it's good. When you see it, you take it. And I would add to this, and thank you for the comment, I would add that the idea of seeing and taking, okay, whether it's the forbidden fruit of the garden or whether it's the daughters of the humans in chapter 6, as Abraham says, when they see you, they will take you. When people operate on the assumption that when they see something, they're going to take it, the last thing in their world they're thinking of is a kind of history. When Joseph says, he's been so good to me in the past, I can see Mrs. Potiphar saying, yes, he was good to you last week. He may be good to you yesterday morning. Is he good to you right now? Seeing and taking means you operate on the moment, what you see now, without any moral calculus. The past doesn't exist. So the point is, what Joseph is talking about is his whole history. Ever since I've come here, he's been this, he's done that. And Joseph contextualizes his behavior today in light of the way this person relates to me over time. But for the one who simply takes what one sees, there is no over time. You live in the moment. And living in the moment means that you can disregard, you can forget, but not take into account, what has happened in the past. It's all about this moment. It's all about, is it good for me today? There's no idea of hakarat hatov, about the past, about relationships, because that's not the way you function. So I think that's also perhaps part of it as well. But in general, it's very hard to know often what people are thinking, because the Chumash doesn't actually typically, or the Bible in general, doesn't actually tell us. So I think that's an important point. Okay.
Rabbi Silber?
Anybody else? Yes.
Yes, Rabbi Silber, one more question from Sarah Olshin. She asks, do you think Joseph protests too much? End quote. It's a lot of verbiage for a yes or no question.
That's a good question. I don't tend to, I don't think so. I don't think I think what he says is very powerful. I think that what he says is a very important teaching. So I don't think it's like Avimelech. When Avimelech says, God, what kind of God are you? He said, she said, there's an attempt to evade responsibility. I don't think he's trying to evade responsibility. He talks about himself. This is what he's done for me. He's saying, listen, I don't know about your relationship with your husband. It's your business. But as far as I'm concerned, this is how I see it in terms of my experience with him. He's trusted me and he's helped me. And therefore, I can't do this. So in general, I think, I like to give people, I like not to, in general in life, I think I like to give people the generosity. I think the Talmud is this way. We are generous in our assessments. I don't like to ask the question, why is the person, what is their motivation? You know what I mean? I think that's a bad road to go down. I presume people, for the most part, except if I really have evidence to the contrary, they're coming from a good place. They may say something that is completely counter to my thinking, but I think it's important to have this kind of generosity of spirit in assessing other people's arguments and focus on the argument, as opposed to, if there's no good reason, sometimes there is reason to doubt people, clearly. But without a strong reason to doubt, I don't think we should go that path. So no, I don't see Joseph here as protesting too much. It is true that the Medrash, many Midrashim, see Joseph as perhaps trying to talk himself out of it. And even the Vayima'ain, which in the cantillation mark is a shalshelet, is this wavering. And according to one view, Joseph came to the house to do his work. We'll get to that next. that according to the one view, he came to the house to finally give in to her. She was nudging him constantly, as we'll see. And he decides, he does something, let's go with, let's find out, give in, what's the difference? We'll never find out anyway, you know? So there is that view within the Medrash that sees Joseph as torn to some degree. It's possible. But again, as a general principle, personally, I like to presume that people are saying something from good motives and not question their motivation. So no, not necessarily. It's my take on it in any event. Okay, now we have the next verse. Vayhi kedabro Yosef yom yom, v'lo shama ileh v'shkav etzla v'yot ima. This is actually a very interesting verse. So first of all, it says she spoke to Joseph every day after day. So in other words, she doesn't take his no as an absolute no. She thinks in some level he can be convinced, which leads me to what I said back before, which is that she's not hearing what he says. It doesn't make sense to her. Yes, I am the greatest. Yes, I can do whatever I want. It'll never find out, which for her is sufficient reason. So therefore, she's not silent. Yosef yom yom, but he refused to listen means to accept. He would not accept what she is saying. Then the Chumash says, "V'shkav etzla v'yot ima." It's very striking because she didn't say sleep next to me. She said sleep with me. Shechva imi. But here the Chumash says he didn't listen to her to lie next to her to be with her. It's very interesting over here, and I'll come back to that in hopefully a little later today about that V'shkav etzla v'yot ima. Once he didn't even want to get too close. He didn't want to put himself in a situation of perhaps of temptation, of things can happen. So he didn't even want Ushkav Etzla, even next to her, near her. He wouldn't do that either. Fine. Now this verse, of course, verse number 10, is an interesting verse for a completely other reason, because this verse has been lifted out of the book of Breshit by a different book and placed in a very strategic and important place in that book. Of course, the book I'm referring to, sure many of you know this already, is of course Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther, which largely plays off the story of Joseph. I forget how many references, and I once counted over 50 references to the Joseph narrative in Megillat Esther. But one of them is this, that one of the critical stories in the Megillah is the chapter 3 when Achashverosh appoints Haman to be in charge of his house, right? So he's inside the gate of the king. And the king gives a command in the Megillah, chapter 3, that everybody inside the gate, in the courtyard of the king, has to bow down to Haman. Mordechai refuses to bow down. The Megillah doesn't tell us why. He simply will not bow down to Haman. And then in the Megillah, in chapter 3, it says, "Vayiru abdei hamelech, asher b'shar melech Mordechai, madu ato ver eit mitzvat hamelech." They say to Mordechai, "Why do you violate the king's command?" That's Megillah Esther, chapter 3, very beginning of chapter 3. And then it says, they would speak to him every day. Right? Let's find that verse. In the Megillah, it's chapter 3. Where are you in Megillah? Let's see. Yeah, right here I have it. It's chapter 3, verse number, chapter 3. Yeah, it's verse number 4. They said in chapter 3, verse 3, why do you violate the king's command? Next verse. Though they spoke to him every day, he refused, right? He refused to listen. They're saying you're violating the king's order then, right? King's command. They spoke to him every day. He refused to listen, right? Yom v'yom. So they go to Haman to see if Mordechai's word would stand. He had told them he's a Jew. Now I don't want to get into this verse. I've spoken about it. It's in my book on the Megillah. I talk a lot about the verse. But what's striking is you have exactly the same story. The difference being in the case over here, Mordechai doesn't give a reason. He just refuses to do it. He's not going to bow down to Haman for whatever reason. Can't get into that. He's not going to bow down to Haman. He doesn't explain why. So therefore they persist. In the case of Joseph, he did explain why. She persists anyway. So it's interesting. And my point about the parallel is that in each of these two cases, the case of Mordechai in the court of the king, in the case of Joseph in Mrs. Potiphar's house, what we essentially have is a kind of test. Mordechai is a Jew. As a Jew, he's not going to bow down. This is his red line. And one way to understand it is Haman is not just a wicked person. He's a Amalek. He's Agag. He's an Agagite. You can bow down in the Bible all the time to people, to kings, constantly. Jacob bows down to Pharaoh. Jacob bows down to Joseph. That's not a problem. It's a sign of respect. But to bow down to Amalek, you can't do that. Because Amalek is the anti-God. Amalek is God's enemy. I can't respect God's enemy. God's sworn enemy. That's his red line. Yes, Mordechai has the ambition of Joseph. Why is Mordechai in the gate of the king in the first place? When he first comes there, he's in Shushan, the city of Shushan. He's not in the gate of the king. He's only in the gate of the king after Esther becomes the queen. You get a sense this is a guy who's catapulted himself up, and he comes from royalty, he comes from Saul, he comes from Kish. So yes, there are people like this. He's a political person. He wants power. He craves power. And craving power is not always bad. You can do a lot of good, but it comes at a cost. And the cost over here is, if you're in the gate of the king, you have to bow down to Haman. If you're not in the gate, you don't have to bow down to Haman. If he stays in Shushan, he can do whatever he wants. Everybody in the gate's got to bow down to Haman. So that's his red line. His red line is, yes, I want power. Yes, I can do good. Yes, yes, yes. My red line is Amalek. I'm not bowing down to Amalek. And that's Joseph. If we go back to our story now and think about Joseph, that's just his red line. Yes, I'm moving up in the world. Yes, I'm in charge of this enormous estate. Yes, I have great power. Came as a nobody, less than nobody. Look what I am today. Fine. Now we have Mrs. Potiphar. And she's saying, listen, I can hear her saying, the Chumash says it, you're in the land of Egypt now. You're not back in the old country, you know? I know what you did in the old country with your quaint ways. We have a different way to work in this country. Not a big deal. I'm not going to know about it either. You know, you look good to me. You're a beautiful, beautiful human being. One of the beautiful people. And that's Joseph's red line. This I can't do. Wherever it takes me, this I cannot do. So it's two stories about the red lines. And the Megillah picks this up, of course. Megillah picks up all kinds of pieces from the Joseph story. This is one of the critical pieces. This is what gets Mordechai in trouble and gets the Jewish people in trouble, almost annihilated. And not because Mordechai did the wrong thing. He didn't do the wrong thing. He did the right thing. The issue in the book Megillah is, I don't want to get into this now, but the issue in the Megillah is not whether Mordechai does the right thing or the wrong thing. Not bowing down to Amalek cannot be wrong. But the only question is, why are you there in the first place? If you don't put yourself in that place, right? If you don't crave the power, your little cousin is the queen of Egypt and you control her. And suddenly she's the queen and you're in the gate of the king. But if you're not in the gate of the king, you never have to bow down in the first place. And the Jews aren't in danger. You have endangered the Jewish people, not by doing the wrong thing, because in that situation you did the right thing. But why are you there? And looking back at our story now with Joseph, not that Joseph chooses to be in the house of Potiphar. He does not choose it. The brothers have chosen it. Maybe God chose it. But de facto, that's where he is. De facto, he is in Mitzrayim. And you're suddenly faced with a whole bunch of choices that were you elsewhere, you wouldn't have to make those choices. But in point of fact, that's where you are. So he's faced with a different range of questions, you know, and it's a real test for Joseph. It's a real challenge. And unless you're in that situation, it's hard to judge. I mean, the Chumash judges positively, but that's where Joseph finds himself. It's interesting, just to conclude the thought, that Rashi, when the brothers come to their father Jacob at the end of chapter 37, and they bring the coat, and Jacob said, oh, the coat of Joseph, coat of my son, Tonet Beni, my son, Tarof Taraf Yosef, Joseph has been torn to pieces. Tarof Taraf Yosef. And Rashi comments, Rashi brings the Medrash, Niba v'lo yada masha niba. He prophesied, but didn't know what he was prophesying. Right? And the Medrash says, I see that Joseph torn to pieces, that he will, and Mrs. Potiphar is going to try to incite him. So what the Medrash means is not that Jacob knows anything about Joseph's whereabouts. Of course, Jacob does not know, obviously. But it's making a different point. Taraf Yosef, Joseph is torn to pieces. Where is Joseph? As Jacob is speaking, where is Joseph? Answer, he's at the butcher. Sarah Tabachim. A butcher carves up meat. Called the torn meat treifa. Taraf Yosef, right? Taraf Yosef. And the point is, Joseph has been torn up. That Joseph is going to spend the rest of his life in the land of Egypt, far away from his father, far away from his traditions. And that's what the Medrash says. That what Jacob said is true, actually. He didn't realize it, but it's true. That Joseph is forever distanced from the family. Maybe not forever, maybe after his death he's reunited. But at the end of the day, he's in a situation where he faces all kinds of challenges that had he not been sent into exile, who knows what Joseph might have become, another Jacob. It wouldn't be four forefathers, three forefathers before. Who knows? He's the most talented of all. But no, but Tarot, he finds it, and then you have to deal with your situation. If someone not in that situation, you can't make judgments because you're not in that situation. And that's the story of Mordechai. And Mordechai put himself in that situation, but he can do a lot of good. On the other hand, it comes at a cost. And we'll see that cost, Joseph will have the same cost. And Joseph's going to be part of Pharaoh's court. You have the same kind of situation. You can't say no to certain things. You can't say no to marrying the daughter of the priest of Egypt, whose name is Potiphar, Potiphera. But we'll get to that story. This is what it's about. Anyway, okay. So now we get back to our story. I'll read a few more verses and I'll take comments or questions. Fine. So she keeps every day shepherding this guy every day because from her perspective, he didn't say no. I could do it. I could do it. I could do it. It would be wrong. She's not listening, not hearing that. And now we're told the following. One day, on this day, he comes to the house to do his work. And the house, for whatever reason, is empty. The Chumash doesn't say why it's empty. The Midrashim say maybe there's a holiday in Egypt, where the Egyptians don't work. Maybe they have their religious holiday or whatever, and Joseph is a Jew, so he's going to work on that day, for whatever reason. Some Midrashim say he dafka comes on a day when no one's home, because he says, listen, she's nudging me every day, let's get it over with, that kind of thing. We don't know. But let's presume that he just happens to be that way. There's no one around. But and she grabs onto his coat saying, sleep with me. So he left, he runs out, he leaves his coat in her hand, and he runs out, he flees, and he goes outside. I want to say a few words about this pasuk, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. So the first thing I want to note for us is that we have the word over here, two words that are critical in this whole episode. I'll take the second first, which is the less critical, and that's the word azav. He abandoned his coat in her hand, and he ran outside. And of course, we remember that earlier, it said about Potiphar, Vayazov kol ashelo biyad Yosef, that he forsook everything into Joseph's hand. He knew nothing that what Joseph did except for the bread that he would eat. And over here, and that the abandoning into Joseph's hand means Joseph has full control of the entire Potiphar estate, the fields, the house, everything. And it's put into his hand. Hand means his control. And now in this moment, Joseph finds his coat, Azav Bigdo Biyada, in her hands. His fate is in her hands. The beged, of course, is not Joseph, but it's about as close as you can get. The beged represents Joseph. So she has Joseph, not the Joseph she wants in her hands, but Joseph's beged, that which represents Joseph in her hands. Let me just say, by the way, as an aside, that the idea that the coat represents the you, that I want you, in this case, but she only gets his coat, plays, this is chapter 39, and plays off, once again, another interesting playing off of the previous chapter of Judah and Tamar. When we studied that chapter, I made several references to connections between Judah, Tamar, and the story that precedes and follows, but there are many more. This is one of them, because in the story of Judah and Tamar, Judah's wife dies. Tamar, his daughter-in-law, has been waiting around for a long time to marry his youngest son, which will never happen. And she realizes that it's not going to happen because he's been playing her. So she dresses up as a prostitute, stands in the crossroads, and he sees her. And his own wife has just died. He's off to the sheep shearing, which is a festive time, and he sees this woman, and he wants to sleep with her. He walks over to her, right? Let's see, the language over there is, says to her, let me come to you. That's in chapter 38. He didn't know it's his daughter-in-law. And she says, what will you give me? What will you give me? He says, I'll send you a goat. And then she says, no. I'm not interested in your goats and your promises. Forget that, not the promises. I'll tell you what I do want from you. She determines. No, forget the promise to send me later. Some guy I know has been promising me for years to send me something. Never happens, never will happen. No, I don't want the goat later. I want something now. Here's what I want to take for you now. Your staff, your seal, which means your coat. So she takes his coat in lieu of him. What she's really saying is, I want you. I don't want something else. I want someone to perform the levirate marriage, which is what's happening now, unbeknownst to you, because her face is covered. He has no idea, but she does. So the coat is representing the person that's in Judah Tamar's story in one way. And over here, it's the coat in lieu of himself that he leaves in her hands. So she has him, but not him. Not the him.
And Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
also, it's the coat. There was the coat that got him into trouble in the first place with the brothers, the Kin'ah. And then here's another reference to coat. And then Shmuel and Shaul and the coat.
Yes, the coat appears in many places, leaving Shmuel and Shaul out of it, because the coat appears in the book of Shmuel in several places. But with Joseph, okay, since you mentioned it, I'll make a comment about that, about the coat. Once again, Judah and Tamar. The point that the difference between Joseph and Judah is reflected in the coat, because Judah gives Tamar his coat and his staff and his seal. But at the end of chapter 38, after his confession, she sends him the coat and says, the father is the one whose coat this is the father of these to be born children. You know what I mean? The fetuses or whatever. I'm pregnant with he's the father of the. I'm pregnant with his children, and Judah says she's right. And when he says she's right, he actually gets back his staff, his seal, and his coat. Judah is somebody who, through confession, is able to regain what has been lost. In the case of Joseph, though, it's very striking. There's more than two coats with Joseph. There's the coat that his father gave him, the ketonet pasim, which is dipped in blood, and that's Joseph never wears that again. Then you have the coat over here that he leaves in the hands of Mrs. Potiphar. And then you have later, when Joseph leaves prison, he dresses, right? By Chalef Simlo Tavi as his prison clothing. Then he switches the prison clothing to appear before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh gives him a set of clothing. So you have somebody who constantly gets new clothing. That's Joseph. As opposed to somebody who is regaining, who's able to somehow regain his past. And that's typical of Judah. Judah is the penitent who able to through confession to regain his past. He regains everything. And yes, confession is necessary to build the family. And Joseph is someone different. Wherever you put Joseph, he succeeds. But he moves to a new place all the time. He's never in the same place. He's moving in different stages. And no matter where you put him, it makes absolutely no difference. He's capable of recognizing the situation and succeeding in wherever you find Joseph. So that's a very striking contrast between Judah and Joseph, which is reflected in the garments. Yes, that is very true. Okay, let me stop and take comments or questions. I don't have a watch. What time is it now?
It is 11:08, and I just
Okay.
want to point out a comment in the chat from
Yes.
Rebecca Rottenberg-Nadler that Yehuda also does regain his family.
Yes, Judah is the catalyst in this book to, yes, he redeems his own family through his confession, and Judah will also be the one who will be the catalyst to build Jacob's family through his confession later on, and through his taking of responsibility. As we noted, Judah is the one who will be the catalyst, and Judah will be the leader. At the end of the day, there are two leaders in Jacob's thinking of the brothers of the nation, but the primary leader, the primary king, comes from Judah and not from Joseph. Joseph may be the most talented, but in terms of leadership, it's about taking responsibility, and that's what Judah reflects. And for Joseph, we'll see, it's very unclear to what Joseph, maybe at the end of his life he does, but unclear to what extent Joseph actually takes responsibility. Maybe we'll see this next week or whenever we get there. But yes, that is very true about Judah. And it's true about the confession, which plays a central role in this book. From beginning to end, the first story of the Chumash. If Adam had said, "You're right, God, I did the wrong thing," maybe we all be learning together in the Garden of Eden. Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, that's not what he says. He says, it's your fault and her fault. She did it, and frankly, God, the woman that you put by my side, so you have to take some of the blame as well. And he doesn't take the blame himself. And God says to the woman, "What did you do?" The snake. There's always some truth in that, but the bottom line is the Chumash is very demanding when it comes to confession. So, right, so we don't have that. And Judah, who is able to confess, is able to unite and to take responsibility, take me as a slave instead of Benjamin. He's the one who builds the family. He's the catalyst, and he's the one whom Jacob rewards with kingship, because everybody respects the one who takes personal responsibility. Okay, we have only a few minutes left here. Let's continue a little bit more here. And fine. So let's see. We're up to fine. So now he let me make one more comment about this. By Yonas vayetze hachutza, he ran outside. Two more comments about the verse. First of all, let me simply note that the little word yad, yud dalet, two-letter word, right? Hand. The word yad figures prominently in this chapter from beginning to end. Because the Chumash says earlier, Joseph comes down to Egypt. He's brought to Egypt in the very first verse. Miyad ha'yishmeelim asher horidu shama. He's brought down to Egypt by the hand of the Ishmaelites. So Joseph was thrown into a pit, right? Remember the brothers said to each other, right? Al tishachu yad. We shouldn't kill him, says Judah, right? Yad al tishachu bo, Ruvain said. So they got about to kill him, and then Reuven and Yehuda says later, "Listen, we shouldn't harm him. Let's sell him instead." And Joseph finds himself in the hands of the Ishmaelites, who bring him down to Egypt. And then in chapter 39, we have the emphasis on Joseph's rise, ascent to power, and we're told that the reason Joseph is so successful is Hashem matzliach biyado. God enables him to be successful. God's hand is operative in the chapter in a very direct way. It's God who's guiding everything. And therefore, Potiphar responds in verse number 4, Kol yeshlo natan biyado. Everything Potiphar had, he gave in Joseph's hand. So Joseph has control. And that's in verse number 4. And then in verse number 6, Vayazov kol yeshlo biyad Yosef. Everything was abandoned into Joseph's hand. So you have the sense over here of the person who was first in the hands of the Ishmaelites, and then through God's intervention, God's intercession, God's hand, everything suddenly is in Joseph's hands. But suddenly everything turns around. The very ascent to power. That's what's great about it. I mean, what's great about the story? There are 100 things great about the story, but it's the very ascent to power which gets you in trouble because Mrs. Potiphar sees him as beautiful only after he has everything biyado. From her perspective, he's the most powerful guy in the house because Potiphar has abandoned everything into Joseph's hand. And therefore, Joseph's in a precarious situation. And at the end of the day, when she grabs onto his coat, Vayazov bigdo biyado, then suddenly his coat is in her hands, and his coat being representing him, suddenly this powerful person finds himself in the hands of Mrs. Potiphar. And what I wanted to comment about that, among other things, is this, that there's something else about Joseph, which is very interesting. Joseph said to Mrs. Potiphar, in explaining why he can't get involved, he makes the statement, Einenu godol babayit hazeh mimeni. There is none greater in the house than me. Now he's saying this to, I claim, to explain why he needs to be grateful. Look what your master has, look what my master has done for me. He's given me so much. There's no one greater than me. But on the other hand, you can read it as a statement saying the truth. Listen, I know I'm the most powerful person here. And what's interesting is, in thinking about that expression, how powerful I am, it reminds me of what Joseph says to his brothers later in the story when he says, I am Joseph. And don't feel bad because God sent me down here. I am Pharaoh's father figure. I'm a master to the entire house and the ruler over the land of Egypt. That's what Joseph says to his brothers. That's chapter 44. In chapter 50, after Joseph buries his father, he wants to bury his father. He wants to bury his father, so he goes to Pharaoh's servants. He says, please, please, please speak to Pharaoh for me, intercede for me. I want to bury my father and I want to return. And that's very striking, isn't it? This is the counselor to Pharaoh, the master of his house. He has to beg the servants to intercede and promise to come back. And the point is, when you read that, what you recognize is that the power Joseph thought he had was fully illusory. Yes, he had a lot of power. You know why? Because Pharaoh uses him, because he makes Pharaoh rich. So of course he has power. And the moment Pharaoh doesn't need Joseph, he has no power. He's just a slave, like even lower than the other slaves. He has to beg the others to intervene. And the same thing is true over here. And that's a problem, I think, as far as Joseph, which is, I think he really believes it. There's none greater than me. But we discover very quickly that's not the case. You think you have so much power. You don't have that much power. You have power that's been granted you by Potiphar. And if the wife intervenes with Potiphar, and she has access to Potiphar, because probably she's included in the bread that he eats. So we suddenly discover that Joseph, the most powerful one, will end up in jail. And he's lucky to end up in jail, I would add. We'll discuss that next week. Why jail and why not the guillotine? The chief butcher can't be squeamish about butchering another person. So there's a good reason that Joseph lives altogether. And that's a very important point for the story. But the point is, Einenu gadol b'bayit hazeh mimeni. If he means it, he's wrong. Because he doesn't really get it. He doesn't understand his real role over here. His role is to make Potiphar rich. And as long as he does that, Potiphar is happy with him. Why even bother checking up? Look at let me see the bank accounts at the end of the day. Totally fine. But the moment he crosses Potiphar, he'll discover exactly how powerful he is. So that's an important point. And the last point I want to make is about the word yad, which runs through this entire chapter. I mentioned several times already. And I want to mention one more point about yad, just to conclude a thought we've started with in the past, about the connection between the previous chapter and this chapter, Judah and Tamar. Because the end of chapter 38, the birth of the twins, Peretz and Zerach, and there too we have the word yad. And it came to pass, the very end of chapter 38, when she was giving birth, Tamar was giving birth, Vayhi b'lidata vayiten yad. So when she was about to give birth, one of them stuck out his hand, one of the twins. And the midwife put on his hand, Vatikshara al yado. She put a string around his hand, saying, a red string, a shani, this one came out first. However, then he brought his hand back in. Meshiv yado, and the other one jumped out first. What a breach you made. And then afterwards, the last verse, then the one whose hand had been put out, who had the red string, came out, and she named him Zerach. And we commented on that there's a play in the Chumash on the word Shani, Shin Nun Yud, and the word Sheni, Shin Nun Yud, second. That the point of the story is that the ambiguity about who was born first is disambiguated. That in fact, the one who has Shani is in fact the second. That's a very, very important point. We discussed that. But my point is the very end of the previous chapter, the last 3 verses have the word Yad 4 times. And because their point is, it's exactly, we know from the hand exactly where how they factor in. The one whose hand was put out has on his hand, at the end of the day, it says he's not son number 1, he's son number 2. And my point is this theme of the hand, then, the Chumash in a different way expands the theme of the hand, and it makes the point, who's in control over here, right? We have that expression, biyado, I have the authority, the power to do something. And the question is, who actually has the power? Who has the control? And by the time you get halfway through the chapter, we understand it's not Joseph. He will have power if his abilities work well for the people that actually have the real power. Then he has a lot of power. And the moment they don't, he has 0 power. He ends up in jail. So they have another example of how the story of Judah and Tamar plays in so many ways, plays into the larger story, and in particular, chapter 39 and the expansion of chapter 38. Now, stop at this point to take 1 or 2 questions, and then we will continue next week, hopefully, with this finishing up this chapter and moving forward. The goal is by the end of the year, not just this semester, the year, to complete Sefer Breshit. That's the goal. Okay, if any comments or questions, I'll take them.
Yes, I just want to point out one from in the chat from Aviva Davidson that I'm pointing out, like, there's no one bigger than me, quote, is similar to Joseph's bragging about when telling his brothers about his dreams, and the tendency of his both times leads to his temporary downfall. Is there a parallel between Joseph's losing coats and receiving new coats to Jacob's process of transformation? Aviva, did I get that right?
The idea of Joseph as one who has a certain conception of where he stands, okay? That's the central theme in the rest of this book. Joseph is, in fact, God's emissary. God is using Joseph to carry out God's plan. That Joseph is certainly understands. What Joseph may not yet understand is what exactly God's plan is. Because God's plan will not be just to feed his brethren temporarily in time of famine. But we'll deal with this later. My point is that the Chumash, what makes it interesting, I mean, what makes it great, is it's very complicated. People are complicated, and Joseph has all different pieces to him. It's never black and white. So yes, I do believe that there's a misunderstanding of one's own role. Look, the guy has been, we understand this, the guy comes down as a Hebrew slave, and now he's in charge of this massive operation. So we understand what he could think. He sees himself as unbelievably successful. Whether he sees God is involved or not, we don't know yet. We can't tell that so far. But we understand that one with success can certainly suggest to someone that they have these abilities. And he sees from where he's come from and where he is, and he looks and says, wow, it's like really amazing. But on the other hand, you have to understand how he got where he got. God is helping him, but it's Potiphar who sees it and understands how to use Joseph for Potiphar's benefit. And that I think Joseph perhaps doesn't fully get, because his statement in Enu Gadol turns out to be very not true, as we will see and we continue next week as well. Okay, I'm going to stop. Yes.
Rabbi Silber, you said, I remember once in terms of Yaakov and Lavan, he thought he was in control. He could leave any time, but he also became a bit of a slave to that household and the possessions and stayed on longer.
That is true. And Yaakov, I did say that. And Yaakov sees one might say he sees a business opportunity, and he stays on another 6 years, and he almost never gets out. So that's a related but a different point, which is that sometimes success can be dangerous in the sense that it tempts us to do things that if we thought about it from a different perspective, we would not have done that. He did intend to leave. He wants to leave. Joseph's been born, he wants to leave, but he sees the potential to make some great financial gains, and he stays for that reason. And at the end of the day, it's not simple. He almost doesn't make it out altogether. That is very true. I'll stop at this point then. So yeah, so I'm going to be next Sunday. We'll hopefully meet. I'm actually leaving to Israel today. Got to see what's going on for Drisha in Israel, and looking forward to learning with you again next week. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber. And our next class coming up later today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time is Midrash on the Parsha with Dr. Samuel Evans. If you would like to join, you can find out more at drisha.org/classes.